Welcome to the fascinating world of neuroscience. Today, we are going to explore the prototypical neuron, the fundamental structural and functional unit of the human brain and the entire nervous system. Imagine holding a highly advanced, microscopic smartphone that can receive, process, and transmit messages across vast distances inside your body. By the end of this lesson, you will understand exactly how these incredible biological machines work, both anatomically and electrically, to make every thought, feeling, and action possible. To begin our journey, let us think of the prototypical neuron as a tiny biological smartphone. Why does this analogy work so well? Because just like your phone, a neuron is a specialized device designed purely for communication. It receives incoming text messages, decides if those messages are important enough to pass on, and then forwards them to other phones in the network. However, instead of using Wi-Fi or cellular data, the neuron uses a sophisticated mix of chemical signals and tiny electrical sparks. Right now, billions of these microscopic communicators are wired together in your head, firing continuously. Without them, our brains would simply be silent, inactive lumps of tissue. Now that we understand what a neuron does, let us look at its physical structure. In neuroscience, the prototypical neuron consists of three main parts. First is the soma, or cell body, which houses the nucleus and the biological machinery required to keep the cell alive. Extending outward from the soma are the dendrites. These look like the branches of a tree and serve as the primary receivers for incoming signals. Next, we have the axon, a single, long, cable-like structure that carries the neuron's electrical output, known as an action potential, away from the soma. Finally, at the very end of the axon are the axon terminals. These terminals release chemical messengers called neurotransmitters, which cross a tiny gap called the synapse to pass the signal to the next cell. Let us visualize the anatomy we just discussed. On your screen is a classic diagram of a prototypical neuron. Starting on the left, you can clearly see the central soma containing the nucleus. Notice the branching dendrites radiating outward. These are perfectly shaped to catch signals from neighboring cells. Moving to the right, follow the long axon extending away from the soma. This is the biological wire that transmits the electrical impulse. You can also see the myelin sheath wrapping around the axon, which helps speed up the signal. Finally, look at the far right, where the axon splits into axon terminals, ready to release chemicals to the next neuron in the chain. This elegant design perfectly matches its function. Having seen its structure, you might wonder why studying this single cell is so absolutely critical. The answer is that every single human behavior, thought, and emotion originates from the activity of these exact cells. For instance, when you accidentally touch a hot stove, sensory neurons in your hand instantly fire electrical signals up to your brain, prompting you to pull away before severe damage occurs. Furthermore, in medical science, understanding the normal function of a neuron allows doctors to pinpoint what goes wrong in neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. Beyond biology, the structure of these cells has directly inspired modern artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms. By studying this microscopic unit, we are unlocking the secrets of both human consciousness and advanced computer science. This brings us to a fascinating question. How exactly does the cell generate its electrical signals? To understand this, we must look at the voltage across its outer skin, known as the cell membrane. A prototypical neuron acts exactly like a tiny, rechargeable biological battery. It stores electrical potential energy, keeping it ready to use the moment it needs to fire a signal. This electrical potential exists because there is a difference in the concentration of charged particles, which we call ions, between the inside and the outside of the cell. The chemical gradient pushes these ions, while the electrical gradient pulls them back. Balancing these forces is what gives the neuron its resting voltage. Now that we know the neuron acts like a battery, let us look at the mathematics behind it. The exact voltage for any specific ion can be calculated using a famous mathematical relationship known as the Nernst equation. Conceptually, this formula tells us the exact electrical voltage that would perfectly balance the chemical push of ions trying to enter or leave the neuron. Let us break down the symbols. E-ion represents the equilibrium potential for a specific ion, measured in volts. R stands for the universal gas constant, and T is the absolute temperature in Kelvin. The symbol Z is the electrical charge of the ion, and F is Faraday's constant. Finally, the terms in the natural logarithm represent the concentration of the ion outside and inside the cell. If the temperature T increases, the resulting voltage will also increase because the ions have more thermal energy and move faster. Before we move on, let us see this formula in action with a concrete example. We want to calculate the equilibrium potential for potassium ions in a mammalian neuron at body temperature. We are given that the outside concentration is 5 millimolar, the inside is 100 millimolar, and potassium has a positive charge of 1. Because we are at body temperature, we use a simplified version of the Nernst equation, where the constants combine to 61.5 millivolts, and we use a base 10 logarithm. We plug in our values, dividing the outside concentration of 5 by the inside concentration of 100, giving us 0.05. The logarithm of 0.05 is approximately negative 1.301. Multiplying this by 61.5 gives us our final answer of negative 80 millivolts. Physically, this means the inside of the neuron must be 80 millivolts more negative than the outside to keep potassium ions perfectly balanced and stop them from leaking out. So, we have calculated the resting voltage of our biological battery. But what happens when a signal actually arrives? Imagine our prototypical neuron is sitting quietly at rest. Its outer membrane acts as a strong barrier, providing electrical resistance against the flow of ions. Suddenly, a chemical signal from a neighboring cell causes the membrane voltage to shift slightly from its resting state. Because the membrane has resistance and there is now a change in voltage, an electrical current will begin to flow across the membrane. This proves that neurons operate as true electrical circuits, albeit on microscopic and highly efficient scales. To understand exactly how much current flows during this tiny event, we need another fundamental principle of electricity. This brings us to Ohm's law, a fundamental principle of electricity that applies perfectly to biological neurons. Conceptually, Ohm's law states that the current flowing through a conductor is directly proportional to the voltage and inversely proportional to the resistance. Let us look at the formula. The symbol I represents the electrical current, measured in amperes or amps. The symbol V represents the voltage change across the membrane in volts. Finally, R represents the electrical resistance of the membrane in ohms. In plain English, if the voltage shift is large, the current will be large. However, if the resistance of the membrane increases, it will block the flow of ions, and the current flowing through it will decrease. This simple relationship governs how electrical signals propagate through your brain. Now that we have Ohm's law, let us apply it to find the exact current flowing across our neuron's membrane. We are given that the membrane has a total electrical resistance of 50 megaohms, which is 50 million ohms. A chemical signal causes the voltage to shift by 10 millivolts, which we must convert to 0.01 volts to match our standard units. We choose Ohm's law because it directly connects voltage, resistance, and current. We plug our values into the formula, dividing 0.01 volts by 50 million ohms. The math gives us an incredibly tiny number, 0.000000002 amps, or 0.2 nanoamps. Physically, this microscopic current demonstrates just how efficient the prototypical neuron is. Because the current is so small, your brain can perform trillions of complex calculations every single second without overheating or running out of energy. We have covered a tremendous amount of ground today. Let us reinforce the most important ideas. First, the prototypical neuron is the foundational building block of the entire nervous system, elegantly designed with dendrites, a soma, and an axon to receive, process, and transmit information. Second, we learned that neurons act like biological batteries, and we can calculate their exact resting voltage using the Nernst equation. Finally, by applying Ohm's law, we proved that our brains operate as highly sophisticated, low-power electrical circuits. Mastering the anatomy and physics of this single cell is your first and most crucial step in understanding the vast complexities of the human brain. Great job today, and keep exploring.